So I'm going to use some images that I found online as examples for why these images have good compositions, to kind of get your brain thinking in the right direction on how to compose your first project drawing. And remember, you can use a viewfinder if you feel comfortable with that, and if you'd rather just wing it, that's fine too. But a viewfinder might help you in the beginning to kind of figure out where your edges are, because the viewfinder's edges will match up with your paper's edges. Okay, so first of all is this very sketchy image, and this image I think is in Canvas too, and I kind of explain a little bit about why this is a good composition. But basically you'll notice that not only is the image divided into thirds this way, so the actual line of the bed where she's lying, and then her hand over her hips and her shoulder make another line, so you're dividing the composition into this is a third, her body is a third, and then the negative space is a third. So that's good, but to make it even better, the artist has divided it into thirds the other way as well. So you'll notice that her hand and her rear end is dividing the composition into this third, and then where her head and her shoulder are is another point of attention, and so our eye goes to that too. So that means that not only is this part a third, but this part is also a third, and then you're left with not so interesting space here, but it's still part of making the composition. 1, 2, which makes 3 across, and 1, 2, which makes 3 up and down. Okay, so next we have a Degas drawing, and I mentioned this one in Canvas as well. You'll see that, you know, because we're human and we recognize faces before we recognize anything else, and that makes us interested in those things. So of course when you're looking at a drawing or a photo or a painting or anything, we go to the face first. So we look at the face. It also has kind of the darkest lines, and because of that we start here, and our eye is either going to go down this arm because this value is similar to this value, and so our brain associates like with like. So directionally we can start at the head, move down the arm, this hand ends, and so our next place to go is this line work is kind of scribbly, so we move to the next thing that looks like that, which is right here. That leg brings us down here, we notice what's happening here, and then because there's a little bit of value and some line work here that's similar to the arm, we move back up to the arm and then back to the head. And so in a good composition, you always want your viewer to move around the composition as though it were a clock. It doesn't matter which direction you go, but that's always a good thing. So if we went the other direction, it depends on just your personality and how you view things. Again, you're probably starting at the head, you're moving down here, you're noticing this, you're moving up the knee to the wrist and then back to the head. Okay, so this image, same thing kind of as the rule of thirds as the first one we looked at. So they don't necessarily hit you over the head with the rule of thirds like the first image did. But what they do is that they use the figures here to go ahead and put us in a third of that chunk of space. And then the bucket helps to divide that as well. And again, going up and down, we kind of notice the bucket and this bucket here, and that divides the space, and then the action of him holding this little girl and his face and his hat divide the other third. So we've got 1, 2, which makes 3 across, 1, 2, which makes 3 up and down. And you'll also notice that because of that, it's slightly off center, so we don't have a lot of action going on in here to balance it, but you don't always want total balance. Sometimes off balance is a lot more interesting. And so you'll notice that this negative shape that's being created here isn't just boring background, but it's creating a shape that isn't just a triangle, but it has interest to it. Okay, next is this drawing. So yes, he is center, and putting things in the dead center is usually not a good idea because it's too expected and makes it a little bit boring. So you want to make your viewer interested in what you're doing. So of course we're going to see the person's face first, and it's going to be dead center. And only if you're trying to make a conceptual piece that talks about iconography or the importance of someone. You know, a lot of times Mary in a lot of paintings from art history was dead center because she was very important. So that's okay, but it does make for a more standard kind of triangular composition. and makes it just a little bit more boring than something that's doing the rule of thirds or directional lines, whether they're literal lines or implied lines. But what this artist does do to help is the use of foreshortening, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. And what that means is we see this in the background, but we see this in the foreground. And since we recognize faces first, even though it's smaller and even though it's further back, when we would typically notice something like that later, we see the face first, so we see that first, and then we move down the arms into the legs and the feet and the knees and all of this interest down here. And even this is an action line that gives us, it breaks up this negative space right here and gives us movement. Even this little symbol here helps with the composition because it's something that we notice because, again, it's a similar color to what's going on over here. So we move over here and then back up to this kind of jazzy line work that's similar to the color and similar to what's going on behind him. So all of these little techniques bring your eye around and keeps you interested. All right, and then lastly is the example you have on your project sheet. So what's working here is, again, the rule of thirds. So we go to her face first, and then this helps bring our eye there as well. So we notice that this is divided into a third, and then since this is similar to that, our eye moves this way, and we notice that that's kind of a rule of third also. You could also consider face is like face, right? So like recognizes like, and that's how our eyes move. So that would be the next third. And what's interesting about this is, this is the most detailed part, so our brain and our eyes are going to want to go there first. So we look at this, we get interested in that, we see what's going on with the shading and the value and everything, and then because the feet are the next thing that's the most shaded and realistic, our eyes go to the feet second. And so what's interesting about that is the pants are just line weight and line quality. There's nothing going on value-wise, and that's okay because if she were all in value, she would just be this clump of positive space with just a little bit of things going on in the background, and she would be the main event, and maybe our eyes would get bored by that. So the fact that we have to skip, almost like an implied leg, we have to skip from this part to this part, makes the composition more interesting. Okay, and so that's all I have for composition in terms of figure. Remember this information. Also look back into all of those files in Canvas if you haven't already. They're full of lots and lots and lots of information, and it can be overwhelming. So just make sure that if you are confused by anything or just need clarification, just let me know.